Hey y'all, it's Engage in time. In this series, I analyze every emblem ring in Fire Emblem Engage. We're going to go over every emblem's abilities, discuss how useful they actually are, and I will provide you with some fun and good builds to try out. Whether you're looking for tips on your first playthrough, or you're an Engage veteran looking for something fresh, whether you're playing on normal, hard, or maddening, this guide is for you. And today, we're covering Sigurd, the emblem of the Holy War. Sigurd is suspiciously present in this game's story and gameplay. He's in quite a few more cutscenes than his fellow emblems, he's got more lines than the others, and he's available for more chapters than any others. All the more reason to see if his abilities hold up to scrutiny. The short answer is, yes they do, and the long answer is, well, look at the length of this video. As always, we'll start with the sync skills. These are skills that you'll have access to as long as someone has the Sigurd Ring on them, regardless of whether you're engaged or not. The first skill is Canter. Your unit can move 2 spaces after acting, and acting is any action that would give a unit experience, so it includes attacking, healing, and dancing. This is one of the best skills in the game, and we'll dive more into it when we're going to discuss inheritance. Suffice it to say for now that Canter allows for a lot of flexibility in how you position your unit. If you've played other games where units can sometimes move after making an action, you might think that 2 spaces isn't a lot. But in this game, where units have so little move in the first place, 2 spaces is significant. Later in the game, you'll also get to upgrade this to Canter Plus to increase this to 3 spaces. Next up is Momentum, learned at level 3. Momentum buffs your attack by 1 for every space a unit has moved to reach the square that they're attacking from, but only for the first attack that unit is making. If you've played Fire Emblem before, you know how big of a difference even 1 point of damage can make, and this skill grants up to 10 points, even more if you get your hands on Momentum Plus at bot level 17. If you're not familiar with Engage or Sigurd, this might not sound like much, but trust me, this skill synergizes really well with the rest of Sigurd's kit. His last sync skill is Headlong Rush, which grants the unit in question immunity to freeze. They can still be targeted by freeze staves if you put them in range, which means they can act as a lightning rod for units that don't have this skill, so it is situationally useful. While synced with Sigurd, you also get some very good stat bonuses, focused on dexterity, defense, build, and most important of all, movement. That's right, without even having to engage, Sigurd gives your unit +1 movement. Now let's see what we can get out of him if we engage. For the duration of 3 turns, you will have access to the following abilities. The first one you'll probably notice is Gallop, which gives a unit 5 more move. If that seems massive, that's because it is. It more than doubles the mobility of your units in the early game before even factoring in Canter. What's more, if your unit is a dragon class like Alir, they will get an additional point of movement. 2 if they're in the cavalry subclass. And if they're a covert, they will no longer incur terrain penalties from forests and such. While engaged with Sigurd, you will also have access to his Emblem Weapons. At first, he only comes with the Rider's Bane, which works just like the regular one. It's a lance effective against other mounted enemies. From my experience, the Rider's Bane is just about powerful enough to one-shot enemy horse riders, as long as the unit using it has decent strength. It is pretty heavy though at 13 weight, so make sure to double check if you're opening yourself up to getting doubled when using it. If you reach bot level 10 with Sigurd, you will also gain access to the Brave Lance. If you're familiar with the series, gaining access to the Brave Lance in the early game sounds too good to be true, and that's because it is. It does attack twice, but only on player phase. Unfortunately, it's very unreliable with its 60 base hit rate, especially since the Brave Lance needs to hit twice to be worth using, as otherwise it's only as strong as an Iron Lance. Unfortunately, Momentum doesn't help much here either, as it only boosts the first of the 2 strikes. If you make it to bot level 15, Sigurd will also have the Turfing ready for you. Turfing is just a sword with good stats, 15 might and 80 hits. The +5 resistance it gives is just a cherry on top. There is not much else to say about it, just use it when it gets the job done. Now while you're galloping across the battlefield, you should look for an opportunity to use Sigurd's Engage attack, Override. When you use Override on an adjacent enemy, you will plow right through, along with any enemy that's in a straight line behind them, only stopping when he reaches a square with no enemies in it. The attack will hit all of them. Override is situational, but very satisfying to pull off. It synergizes very well with the rest of Sigurd's kit. You can use the Rider's Bane to kill a line of several cavaliers, and Gallop allows you to pick the perfect spot to override from, as well as build up momentum damage. Keep in mind that you can only use your engage attack once per engage meter. Once you've expended override, you won't be able to reuse it until you engage again. That said, opportunities to override multiple enemies aren't very common, so if you see one, by all means go for it. Override also has several other bonuses depending on your unit's subclass, but I'll go into more detail on that when we're talking about builds. Like the other emblems, Sigurd has a Divine Paralogue which you'll have to play if you want to unlock bond levels beyond 10. That is definitely worth doing in order to gain access to Canter Plus, Momentum Plus, and Tierfing. The map can seem fairly daunting, with the beginning having a lot of enemies close to each other. If you can get through the initial wave though, the worst will be behind you. Gaining control of the castle will cause a bunch of reinforcements to come out. Then, Sigurd will lead all those enemies into battle against you. You can isolate Sigurd from his allies very easily due to his higher mobility, maybe even trick him into overriding your units to get him in a position where you can gang up on him. If you want the secret goddess icon hidden on the map, you might want to send a flyer to pick it up before defeating Sigurd. Now let's address the elephant in the room, inheritance. Canter is the best inheritable skill in the game, and anyone who can reach 1000 SP before chapter 10 should probably inherit it, unless you have a really good reason not to. That reason can be, I'm playing on maddening and I really need a specific pair of inherited skills to have acceptable combat, or it can be, I found this neat combo I want to try, or even just, I don't feel like it. But generally speaking, if you're trying to maximize a unit's potential, Canter is the way to go. As I have explained before, you get an unconditional 2 movement after attacking, dancing, healing, or any other action that grants EXP. This is useful in almost any situation, getting closer to the next combat, positioning yourself away from enemy chain attacks, getting out of the way so someone else can use the square you attacked from, getting onto defensive terrain, getting off of dangerous terrain, the list goes on. If you have another 1000 SP to spare, you could even upgrade to Canter Plus. Since most units will want to reserve that SP for combat skills, this is most relevant for units that fill support roles, most notably your Dancer Seadoll and staff units like Hortensia. If your Alir is mostly doing support, he likely has room for it too. Everything else that Sigurd has to offer inheritance-wise pales in comparison, but let's go over it anyway. The Hit Plus skill can be a nice consistency bonus, but only if your unit really doesn't need their SP or skill slots for something else. Personally, the only time I've ever used it is on an early game unit I planned on benching later on anyway. I feel similarly about Lance Power, which gives a sizable boost to your attack when using a lance at the cost of your avoid. It's nice if your unit is already using lances and you don't care much about dodging, but the SP cost is pretty steep. Headlong Rush, on the other hand, is pretty cheap at 200 SP. If there is a unit you would like to be immune to freeze, it can be nice to pick up. Inheriting Momentum can be a good minor power boost to one attack, though without Sigurd's movement boost from Gallop, it's probably worse than the alternatives. For example, you could take Strength plus 2 from Roy. It does almost as much damage if you double attack, and it doesn't require the movement setup that Momentum does. However, Momentum is nice if you have a bit more movement, or you're just spamming your engage attack. Surprisingly, Momentum works with all 4 hits of Quadruple Hit, leaves engage attack, so that can be some nice synergy. You know, while we're at it, let's look at some good builds. I think we've established that Sigurd is a really useful emblem, so who makes the best use of him? And are there any fun combos we can make? Generally speaking, Sigurd goes well on units that can already use lances or swords. It lets them pick and choose which weapon to use override with. That might sound small, but having only Sigurd's Rider's Bane is very limiting. It has no 1-to range, it has lower might than a steel lance, and it cannot be improved at the blacksmith. You also cannot trade another weapon to the top of his inventory when you use it, so that's why a lot of these recommended builds are going to be lance users, since lances have more might than swords. Let's start with the more straightforward ones. Flyers like Chloe have an innate ability to ignore terrain costs, so they can use Sigurd's movement bonuses to the full extent. They can fly across the entire map to do massive damage with momentum, they can pick off stray enemies, and generally they make the most out of the flexibility that Sigurd provides. Cavalry units like Alfred get +2 move from Gallop. They get a lot of the same benefits as the Flyers, just to a lesser extent, although sometimes by having to go around terrain, they can get more momentum damage. Then there's Louis. If you've played on normal or hard, you know you can throw Louis into almost any group of early game enemies and watch him come out on top. It makes sense to pair Sigurd with whoever you want to get into battle the most. On maddening, this pair is a little less potent because maddening enemies will often ignore Louis if they don't do any damage to him. Sigurd isn't helping here since he adds extra defense to a unit. Still, Louis is a unit you can often push forward without much risk, so it can still be a good combo. Next are Etier, Alchrist and other covert units. Putting Sigurd on them allows them to ignore terrain costs. It doesn't let them cross terrain they wouldn't be able to move over normally, but they can now zip across forests without incurring a penalty. The higher movement and Canter turns them into bow knights that can do 2 or even 3 range attacks and then canter into a better position. Tamara is also interesting. Sigurd boosts some stats Tamara needs really badly. Her build, so she isn't weighed down by weapons as much, and her defense for more durability and sandstorm damage. Speaking of sandstorm, if you override a group of enemies, it can proc on each enemy individually, creating some funny big numbers. One combo you might not expect is Sigurd and Selene. If you put Sigurd on a unit with the mystical subclass, Override deals a nice amount of extra damage. Now, Override requires that you use either a sword or a lance, and the only mystical class with access to one of these is Selene's personal class. To make things better, just like Sandstorm, you can proc Ignis on each enemy while using Override, so bring out your Levin sword, maybe refine it a little bit, and go to town. Lastly, let's talk about Seedal. This is not my personal favorite, but I've seen it mentioned a lot. Seedal does make good use of the increased movement and Canter, but Canter he can just inherit. Generally, I recommend using other means to help Seedal get around the map faster, such as reposition and mobility staves, and keeping Sigurd on someone who actually fights. I think Seedal is a bit of a waste of Sigurd's great combat potential, but the combination does work. As always, this list is by no means supposed to be exhaustive. It's meant as a starting point with a mix of good and fun ideas on who to put Sigurd on. If there is a combination you would have liked to have seen in here, let me know in the comments. Finally, let's talk about Sigurd's Engrave real quick. It has basically no downsides, it simply gives a weapon +1 might and +20 avoid, as well as -1 weight. Just like with the Marth Engrave, make sure to put it on a weapon you're using a lot during the early game, and then you can just kind of forget about it. If there's a unit you plan on turning into a dodge tank, they're a fine candidate. For example, you can throw it on one of your daggers, so your thieves can use the avoid bonus in conjunction with terrain, their covert bonus, and their own good avoid. You do get other engraves that give even more avoid though, so you might want to switch to those when they come up, and put Sigurd on something else. In case it wasn't clear, I'm a big fan of Sigurd and his ring. It's definitely up there for one of the most powerful ones in the game. The options he provides are really good, but they do require some thought to get the most out of. There are countless funny combos you can do with Sigurd, such as using the Obstruct Staff to hinder your own movement to get more damage out of momentum. You can also have a unit inherit Draconic Hex and then have them override through multiple enemies to give them all a massive debuff. There's some room for creativity in there that I really enjoy. I do think Sigurd is at his best in the early game. In the first 10 maps, he adds both substantial mobility and power, whereas later on it feels like it's mostly just about the mobility, and the power boost isn't as significant, perhaps because you get so many other combat tools that are more practical. But Sigurd is still almost always worth putting on someone, just for that 5 move, and I can't stress enough how good Canter is. If one of your units really doesn't have room for Canter, you might want to put Sigurd on them just so they can still have it. So that's my take on Emblem Sigurd. Let me know what you think down below, and while you're there, seize the like button to turn it blue. If you think I made a horrible mistake somewhere, you might like to know that I let people nitpick my scripts on my Discord server, so consider stopping by there. Shoutouts to these people for proofreading this one, and while I'm here, thanks to Athena for editing the video. Thanks to my patrons for funding it, and thank you for watching.